we started recording. So welcome again to you all to this new session of our climate change seminars. As you remember, this session is in a sense a joint venture together with Wu Gator's Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies and Labont, based by the University of Turin, here represented by its director, Professor Andina, and I'm really glad for introducing this meeting because this is also an activity, a research activity, and also a moment for spreading the results of research of our speakers, which is linked to the educational and research activities that our curriculum embedded in the PhD program in sustainable development and climate change is sustaining. Therefore, I'm really glad to welcome young scholars and the other people here at Gatorade, here renewed and Gatorade for listening to our today's speaker. And this is just one of the activities that we do hope to be able to create and to promote in this PhD program. And why not by renewing and enlarging and deepening also the already stable bridge that links together this University of Sant'Anna School and the University of Turin. Therefore, I'm leaving the floor to Professor Noll, just by adding, if I may, and then by leaving the floor and the presidency of this meeting to the colleague Tiziana Andina, just by recalling to you all that Professor Noll is an assistant professor in the School of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs at Washington State University. She's an expert on food justice and food sovereignty, local food movements, and the application of biotechnologies in food production. And she's affiliated with the Functional Genomics Initiative, which applies genome editing in agricultural research and the Center for Reproductive Biology. Among a number of publications, let me just...
chiamato chiaramente Giulia, vero? Ma te sbagli, sta aspettando chiamata da sei
giorni, for asking Licinia to switch off her mic. I did this being the organizer of this meeting. I do hope that you don't mind for that. Please just keep your mic as switched off and your camera on. You're more than welcome to show your profile and your face to the camera, and but just keep the microphone off, please. Trying to conclude, I was mentioning among her publication just these. Let's start with which is a co-authorship and editorship of Field Guide to Formal Logic, and which is also the Routledge Handbook of Philosophy and of the City. This is to say that, as you know, food justice and food movements and also food production is a really burning issue for the present day and the future segments of the debate related to climate change and sustainable development. And therefore, we are really glad, being sure of interpreting also the talk of Tiziana, to have our Samantha here among us and to let to her the floor in order to introduce the topic. Thanks indeed for having accepted our invitation, and thanks to Fausto for having procured this.
Thank you,
please, Samantha. Here you are. Yeah, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I very much appreciate the invitation to discuss some of my recent work on ecological resilience and food security and how both of these are being impacted by climate change, and in fact mitigation strategies should be intertwined concerning these two areas. So I'd like to share my screen if I may. Let me see if it will. Go.
Perfect. You can see it in a perfect way.
Wonderful. There we go. Okay, so today I'll be discussing climate change impacts to agricultural production and ecological resilience, as well as some of the ethical and ontological tensions guiding initiative to mitigate these. Let's see if I can. There. All right, and so you provided a wonderful introduction, and I very much appreciate that. I always start my presentations off with a joke that my name is Dr. Noll and not Dr. No, which my students tend to think of, especially at the end of the semester, likening me to a James Bond villain. But there is no relation, I swear. So my work primarily focuses on looking at the ethical and social issues associated with the application of biotechnologies in agriculture. And I'm very much interested in seeing how values, assumptions, and ontological commitments influence local food movements on the ground and food choices concerning what's on our plates. And today, both of these, the ethical and ontological structures, will be highlighted in this talk. So my talk today will be structured as follows. I want to briefly go over climate change impacts to agriculture and food security and impacts to ecological resilience, as these are guiding different mandates, as we'll see in the IPCC literature concerning climate change mitigation. Then we'll be exploring the tensions between the prioritization of addressing climate-induced food insecurities and the mitigation of ecosystem impacts. We'll be looking at how the commitments are guiding these different initiatives. And then I'll be ending by presenting an argument that agriculture and ecological impacts are intertwined, and this is exacerbated by a changing climate. And thus, environmental impacts need to play a major role in how agricultural production shifts in order to meet increasing food security demands. And so there's a lot to cover. And so I'll try to be swift, so to speak, but there are many moving parts. So as everyone in this room knows and is aware of, the climate is changing, and climate change occurs when changes in the Earth system result in new weather patterns. I often have to spend a lot of time discussing this with my students, but I'm glad we can just start here. You know? So according to NASA, the warming of the climate system, and they say it's unequivocal since the 1950s, and many of the observed changes are unprecedented over decades to millennia. And so we're seeing shifts in weather patterns, we're seeing ocean temperature changes, the amount of snow and ice is diminishing, sea levels are changing, greenhouse gases and CO2 levels are increasing. And all of this has major impacts on the world in which we live. And so climate change impacts are often conceptualized by citizens on the ground as something that's outside of the window, something that's occurring over there, as an abstract problem happening that's not impacting their lived experience. So when you're watching television shows or YouTube, little snippets on climate change, they tend to focus on the extinctions of megafauna, especially the cute megafauna, for example, like polar bears and whatnot, or impacts to those larger animals, shifting weather patterns, melting ice, and whatnot. And so this tends to sort of support the idea that climate change is not something that's impacting us in our cities, in our lived experience, in our homes, and whatnot. However, climate change and changes to climate have major impacts concerning what we eat and what is on our plate. So I'd like to go over some of these impacts to sort of set the foundation for the talk. So drastic shifts in the climate equal uncertainty on the ground. As we're seeing changes in precipitation levels, warming temperatures, cooling temperatures, variability is changing. And when we're talking about uncertainty concerning weather, this has a drastic impact on agriculture because this influences when crops are being placed into the ground, when they're first planted, the overall life cycle of the crop, and when they're harvested and whatnot. And uncertainty is the hobgoblin of the farmer, so to speak. And so with this greater uncertainty, we're going to see major impacts to agricultural production. And so according to the National Climate Assessment, many regions are going to experience declines in crop and livestock production, from increased stress due to weeds to insect pests, which are increasingly causing a problem, and various climate-induced stresses, such as drought, for example. Just to utilize an agricultural zone that's very close to where I live, California, for example, on the west coast of the United States, produces more food than any other state in the United States. And yet, it's been dealing with 20 plus years of drought, and this drought has only exacerbated to the point where when you fly over California, large swaths of trees are literally dead. You can see these dead zones due to lack of water. And farmers just this year have been having to pull out otherwise healthy almond trees because there's just not enough water to support almond growth in that area anymore. Almonds are a very water-loving plant. There's no water. And so even though these are healthy trees, they're being removed. And so there's this push where food grows where water flows. And with these shifting of our ideal agricultural ranges and with the changing weather patterns, we're seeing this uncertainty having very real impacts in the production side. So the EPA argued that climate change could make it more difficult to grow crops, raise animals, and catch fish in the same ways and same places that we've done in the past. And just to briefly touch upon the fishery impacts, we're seeing salmon populations in the Pacific Northwest. These are greatly impacted, as well as the crab industry between Alaska and Washington State as well. And so there are negative impacts across the board that are already being realized. And so impacts to crops, livestock, and fisheries then equal disruptions in food availability, disruptions in access to food, and food quality. Nutritional content, the nutritional content of the food that we're producing is literally diminishing. So according to the IPCC, food security will be impacted by future climate change. They're predicting a cereal price increase. They're also arguing that low-income consumers are going to be particularly at risk. And with the increased levels of CO2, we're also seeing the nutritional levels of food being reduced. And due to the interconnectedness and extreme events, risks of food system disruptions are growing, and they say this with high confidence. And so this is something that is seen as essentially inevitable. I wish I could say I wasn't bringing doom and gloom into the presentation. So rising food insecurity then often is utilized to support the position that we need to push for greater efficiency in our agricultural production zone. And so there's this focus on, and I would say a myopic focus on, the techno fixes and the intensification of industrial agriculture. And there's an argument that, well, we need to feed the world, right? We are living in a context where populations are doubling globally every 20 to 25 years, depending on which research you're looking at. 815 million people, 1 in 9, don't have enough food to eat already. And now we're looking at drastic impacts to our already struggling agricultural production systems. And so how can we address this? Well, we can utilize biotechnologies, we can push for greater efficiency in our agriculture, and squeeze out as much food as we can get from our production systems that are already stressed, so to speak. And we see this in the IPCC guidelines. I quote, agriculture and the food system are key to global climate change responses. And here, combining supply side actions such as efficient production, transport, and processing. So efficiency, as we'll see, comes to the forefront again and again when we're talking about food security and when we're talking about addressing climate impacts to agriculture. And there are good reasons for this recommendation, right? Because between 1960 and 1995, post-World War II, with the Green Revolution and various developments in agricultural technologies, production more than tripled. One farmer today can produce enough food to feed 155 people, whereas at the turn of the century, a single farmer would produce enough food to feed 3 to 4 people. So this resulted in an abundance of low-cost food and helped to avert global food shortages. So according to the FAO, much progress has been made in reducing hunger and poverty and improving food security and nutrition. And again, gains in productivity and technological advances, focusing on that efficiency component, have contributed to more efficient resource use and improved safety. There's also a turn in this time period from 1960 to 2015 for greater consolidation of agricultural production in the global food sector. Supporters of this consolidation, and in fact in the United States, just to use that as an example because it's on the top of my head, food is produced by 1.2% of the population. And so we have a relatively small portion of individuals actually engaged in agriculture. So greater consolidation in the food sector equates improvements in the efficiency of food delivery, improvements in food quality, and the facilitation of the diversification of diets. So we're seeing benefits here. However, there are also concerns as well. For example, concerning consolidation, and we won't get into that very deeply in this talk. However, food sovereignty movements around the world are very much pushing back against this because food consolidation or the consolidation of agriculture oftentimes creates serious barriers to the participation of smallholder producers. Essentially, what's happening is as agriculture becomes more expensive due to inputs, nitrogen fertilizers, et cetera, and due to the rising cost of agricultural technologies, this is causing small farmers to be pushed out of the industry. And then we're seeing the consolidation of agricultural lands into the hands of a few. And this results in the reduction of food sovereignty, the ability of communities to have a control or a say concerning food production, and impacts rural areas as resources are being extracted from these areas and resources aren't being reinvested in rural communities. And concerning industrialized farming and the further industrialization, there's also problems as well. To pull from a popular piece by the United Nations Environment Program, in 10 Things You Should Know About Industrial Farming, they literally stated, and the language was so strong here, that industrialized farming is fundamentally at odds with environmental health. And so they argue that industrialized farming and produces greenhouse gas emissions, pollutes air and water, as we see, especially with concentrated animal feeding operations, destroys wildlife. And if you take these externalized costs into account, then they argue that environmental impacts yearly account for about the US dollars of 3 trillion every year as additional costs that are being that are coming out of the agricultural sector and food production. In addition, industrialized agriculture in general, depending on the context, reduces biodiversity levels, as by its very nature, monocrop farming is the planting of a single crop, a single type of species, and there's not a lot of diversity in a cornfield, you know, right? And so biodiversity levels are impacted, and these fields also act as major barriers to species migrations. And so environmental impacts are a serious issue then for agriculture, and as well due to climate change. And climate change is only exacerbating these issues. So ecological resilience is, in addition to food production, is being impacted by a changing climate. So according to Urban, for example, in 2015, he argues that if we follow our current business as usual, climate change threatens 1 in 6 species, a total of 16%. And Urban's prediction here, coming in 2015, is very conservative. I was reading more recent pieces in Nature where, depending on which species group we're looking at, like amphibians, for example, are hard hit, we could be looking at an extinction rate of upwards of 70% for some groups. And so the information keeps on changing, but extinction events are on the horizon and already here. And in addition, some of these threatened species are keystone species, and keystone species are important for ecological resilience, for maintaining ecosystem health and the ecosystem services that we need to survive as the species Homo sapiens sapiens, you know? And so the reduction of resilience then negatively impacts ecosystem services and the ability of the natural world to support life. In addition, species are also being pushed to migrate. They are adapting on their own. So according to recent studies, a wide range of species distributions are beginning to shift as a result of climate change. So for example, just to utilize the cuddly polar bear, polar bears are moving north, and they're also moving into human population centers looking for food. Pikas, for example, which are adorable little rodent creatures that live on the mountaintops right near where I live, they're moving up the mountains in order to stay within their ideal climate niche. And we're seeing many species move. So essentially, the ideal climate or climate niche that species thrive in, these tend to be moving up, and species are moving with the climate strip, so to speak. And so Tingley et al. Found that out of 53 bird species that they tracked, over 90% of these species have already shifted their range due to climate change impacts. So species are already on the move, and a spectrum of flora and fauna are in the process of moving, including trees. We're seeing trees begin to slowly migrate north, although very slowly. But there's calls because of the massive change in the climate for assisted migration to help those species that cannot move. However, we'll bracket that, but it's an interesting topic concerning whether or not we should or should not engage in that. So a spectrum of flora and fauna are in the process of moving to higher elevations further north. And just to illustrate a image from the Nature Conservancy, This shows where species have to migrate to escape climate change in the United States, with pink representing mammals, blue for birds, and yellow for amphibians. And if you check this out on their website, you literally see them moving, the lines moving to new habitat zones. And so the natural world is on the move. Adaptation strategies are being employed all around us. However, climate-induced migration is greatly impacted by human activity. And so our infrastructure, for example, our roads and highways and bridges, these are all negatively impacting the way that animals and flora and fauna can move. Our cities and our urban areas are built. Landscapes are causing barriers to movement. This caused me in another piece to argue that cities and urban dwellers have an ethical responsibility to place corridors in these built environments in order to help facilitate the movement of species. And agriculture. We oftentimes think of barriers in terms of our cities and our streets, but agricultural zones are perhaps one of the most pervasive barriers to species migration. And this is because of the sheer size of agricultural production and the amount of land being utilized for food production around the world. And so according to the FAO, food and fiber production has only exacerbated this problem. Human activities of agriculture and intensive forest cultivation, in conjunction with the development of urban areas, create physical, chemical, and ecological barriers that prevent the natural movement, these natural adaptation strategies of animals in the short term and the gradual shift of populations in the long term. And just to illustrate what we're talking about here concerning barriers, this is a illustration from the World Bank. And depending on which research we're looking at, the amount of land under agricultural production will shift. However, just to look here, the land area used for agriculture is quite intensive, especially in several contexts. And so in Europe, for example, depending on the country, we're looking at a 30 to 80% utilization of land for agricultural production. In Mexico and the United States, we're looking at a 30 to 60% of the land mass being utilized for ag. And so these barriers are quite large then. And when we're talking about shifting agricultural production methods to ensure food security, this is going to have a large impact on the ecological resilience of all the populations in these areas. So these barriers impact species adaptation to climate change. So it seems like we have a serious conflict then. On the one hand, we have impacts to an already stressed global agricultural system, where food insecurities are very much a reality for many people in their daily lived experience, with roughly 815 million people not having enough food to eat. We have the doubling potentially of populations with agricultural zones already in production and very little land to actually be added to our agricultural production. And so we live in an age where people are going hungry, and this number is expected to rise. But ecosystems are being greatly impacted by both climate change and industrial agriculture. And in fact, industrial agriculture is a potential barrier to non-human animals' own adaptation efforts. So what do we do here? How do we address this conflict that seems to be clearly coming to the forefront? Well, first, before we answer this question, we should first look at what the ethical commitments are that are guiding these two prioritizations, the priority of food security and the priority of ecological mitigation. And hopefully then this could provide us with some recommendations for how to mitigate this conflict. And in fact, as we'll see, if we accept a human-centric ethic, then the focus tends to be on addressing the impacts of agricultural production and thus food security. And that is very much highlighted in the food security literature. So food security is often conceptualized as an economic and technical problem, largely focusing on access and resource bundles. Just to again pull from the United Nations, food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences in an active and healthy lifestyle. And here in this illustration, they tend to focus on access. Do you have access to the resource bundles necessary to meet your daily caloric needs? The utilization, are the resources available being utilized appropriately? So increasing utility here. Stability, are agricultural production areas stable, or is there fluctuation in the amount of foodstuffs that's being produced? And availability, is there an appropriate amount of food that's available at any time? And so we see this sort of focus on utility play very strongly in the food security literature. But as Lopez Gunn et al. Argue, food security is, quote, not only a technical challenge, but also a problem of fundamental ethical values and political will. Now, my colleagues in the School of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs, the political scientists, tend to focus on the political will bit. But the ethical values part of this, I think, plays a major role in driving food security initiatives. So if we pop the hood, so to speak, and we look at some of the ethical commitments, we can start to understand why there is this focus on efficiency. So the normative positions typically driving food security largely concern increasing the availability of resources, so utility there, and determining who should have access to resources, especially with the rise of the conception of food access as a right, and how access then can be improved to help those exercise their right to food. And so utilitarian rights-based frameworks then form the foundation for these food security initiatives, which influence our agricultural production methods. And so just to look at very quickly the history of food security, that term was coined even though the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights very much listed food as one of the primary rights, along with medical care, housing, etc. But food security as a term was coined during an international policy and development discussions that occurred in the 1970s. And again, like that illustration highlights, the initial discussion focused on food supply, the availability of people to access resource bundles, and ensuring the stability of food production, etc. And focused on the economic realities as well concerning stable prices. But international communities gradually moved away from this position, adopting a wider conception of food security that recognized social determinants of hunger, including social and political forces. And there was this shift to recognize food access as a right. So while the right to food was first discussed in 1948 in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, we're seeing in 1996 the formal adoption of a right to food. And this was marked as a milestone achievement by the World Food Summit delegates. Now today, we have over 40 countries recognizing this right to food. So we have utility, as we'll see, but we also have very clearly rights-based language being utilized. And when we say we have a right to something, I have a right to housing, I have a right to access to medical care, I have a right to foods, it's very strong normative language. Whenever you say you have a right to something and you're not accessing that, or you don't have access to that bundle of goods, then this also entails a duty to ensure that your rights can be exercised. Otherwise, that's seen as a violation of your autonomy, so to speak. And so the normative language is very strong there, and it is human-centric, most definitely. But there's also, as we saw with the illustration, clearly a utilitarian component, because we're talking about the most efficient utilization of resource bundles. And so there's a push to utilize resources in a way that brings about the greatest good for the greatest number, or at least arguments concerning that. And that's pushing the second argument that IPCC makes. And there's also a push to increase yields and to minimize food waste. So again, efficiency is playing a major role here, because the more resources that we produce, oh, excuse me, this equates to more people being able to exercise their right to food. And this is what's guiding this feed the world mentality that we're seeing in some of the agricultural circles. And in fact, Paul Thompson, in his analysis of food policy, supported this point, arguing that utilitarian-based arguments in this context include the doctrine of allocative efficiency as the norm for the effective resolution of conflicts. And he argued that this doctrine includes a utilitarian maxim and the allocative efficiency mandate, that resources need to be distributed so that their utility is maximized in order to bring about, and again, the just distribution of goods. So we have rights-based language and justice components here, which feeds into food justice movements as well. And so the right to food and utility then is intertwined. Efficiency and rights are connected. So we have this guiding food security initiatives and this push again for efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. But in addition, food here is also clearly conceptualized as a resource bundle, right? As something that is fundamentally separate from the environment within which food has been produced. And so we need only look at some of the literature coming out of development ethics, for example. Amartya Sen, an economist, development ethicist, was one of the first voices to create the capabilities approach, with Martha Nussbaum being another voice in this field. In his analysis of hunger, he very clearly highlights how food is conceptualized as something separate. So he argues that when millions of people die from famine, it's common to think that there's a reduction in food output and the ability of food. However, famines often occur when we have a plethora of food resources. So it's not the ability, it's not the availability, it's the ability to acquire food. And so we're looking at here food as resource bundles that you have access to or you do not have access to. And a resource bundle then is the conceptualization of food as something that's separate from the environment, as something that can be traded on the market, that's sort of not entailed in these larger ecological impacts. And that conceptualization in and of itself is driving this push to downplay or externalize or not recognize the larger environmental impacts that we're seeing concerning food production. And so if you accept these ethical and ontological commitments, then priority should be placed on addressing impacts to agricultural production, even if this means greater intensification. We have a right to food. We need to increase utility in order to ensure that more people's rights are exercised, and so that we can address food insecurities around the globe. But environmental impacts are hard to ignore. as Aiken in 1984. This is an old quote. This was back when oh goodness, video killed the radio star, right? Or yes, you know? Oh, and the birth of MTV, 1981, right? So he argues that since agriculture causes environmental damage as a result of growing food to feed people, there seems to be an unresolved conflict that's only being exacerbated by climate change now, 40 something years later, between human needs on the one hand and environmental integrity on the other. And then Vox discusses this tension, arguing and discusses this tension as trade-offs concerning agriculture and environmental uses. Trade-offs such as the reduction of biodiversity levels and the disruption of annual migrations. And he argues that these trade-offs often prompt arguments to prioritize ecosystem resilience and wider environmental sustainability. And so these arguments then call for wider normative consideration to include the biotic community. And environmental ethicists have been very vocal in arguing that ecosystems, individual animals, and or entire species should be placed into the moral sphere. We should reconceptualize what we think of as a moral agent to include non-human others. So just to pull very quickly from Aldo Leopold, who is one of the initial voices in environmental ethics, the newish field of environmental ethics, and also was a founding father of what was then the newfangled scientific discipline of ecology in the early 1900s. He argued that we should think of ethical consideration in ecological terms, essentially, and that moral spheres essentially expand to include more individuals as they develop. And he has this apocryphal tale where we had a very small conception of who was a moral agent during the time of the Greeks, where it was only men who owned property. And so this was expanded gradually to include women and various other groups, woohoo, you know. And now it should now it should be expanded even more to include the land. And that was his land ethic, that non-human others and ecosystems essentially should be placed within the ethical sphere and given ethical importance. So a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community, and it is wrong when it tends otherwise. So he wants us to engage with or shift our understanding of what is an ethical agent and ensure that ecosystem impacts are included in our everyday engagement with the natural world. And so this work highlights a tension between human-centric concerns and what Lopez Gunn et al. Called intangible values, or larger environmental impacts that arise when we talk about food security. Intangible values, such as what Rachel Carson discussed in her work in Silent Spring in the 1960s, when she was critiquing the utilization of DDT and other inputs in agriculture, and asked us to imagine a spring that is silent because all of the birds had died due to DDT poisoning. And that was such a powerful piece that it prompted the United States Senate to do a formal inquiry into agricultural production, and it also pushed for the banning of DDT. And so these intangible values, these trade-offs, so to speak, come to the forefront as something that's fundamentally in conflict with this larger ecological ethic. And so I won't do a deep dive into environmental ethics, but depending on which ethic you look at, different climate change impacts come to the forefront as ethical concerns. If we look at ethical holism or ecocentrism, for example, the idea that the land or that ecosystems should be given ethical importance, then ecosystem functioning is important. if we look at individual animals and ethical individualism or biocentrism, and then the impacts to those migrating animals become important. And then new work, such as by Sandel and Savlichew, largely prompted due to the mass extinction events that we're seeing. There are discussions about, well, is species a category, or should we see species as something that has ethical importance as well? And there is a current debate about that. But if we do, then species and genetic diversity has ethical importance too. And so regardless of which ethic we focus on concerning environmental ethics, climate change induced impacts and agricultural trade-offs come to the forefront as ethical issues, be that ecosystem functioning, extinction, or migration. And so it seems like we're back at the beginning, right? We've gone through, we've looked at some of the ethical foundations of both, and the conflict just is exacerbated, because not only do we have a conflict between ensuring food security and addressing food insecurities versus mitigating environmental impacts and ensuring ecological resilience, but now we have different ethical arguments sort of coming to the forefront and butting their heads here, with the food as a right and utilitarian conceptions on the left, and biocentrism, ecocentrism, species-focused ethics on the right. So what do we do, right? I'm just going to leave it there. No, I'm kidding. Well, I argue that it's not either or here, and it's not which one we pick, but it's how we address food insecurity that is highlighted by this analysis. The analysis pushes us to potentially reconsider how food insecurities are addressed in the context of climate change. Because as Lopez Gunn said, and as we discussed earlier, food security is not only a technical challenge, but a problem of fundamental ethical values. And so if food security historically has been treating food as something separate from the environment, and if food security as a paradigm was guided by human-centric concerns, and we need to expand these concerns in similar to the way that Aldo Leopold argued concerning moral considerability to include mitigating environmental impacts. So yes, increasing the availability of resources is important. Yes, determining who should have access and the right to food is an important component. But when we're thinking about what changes we're making to agricultural production, mitigating environmental impacts, because of both how climate change is exacerbating agricultural impacts to the environment, should come to the forefront as well. And so, why so? And this is because climate change stresses how much agriculture and environmental impacts and thus mitigation strategies are intertwined. Food security mandates shouldn't be blind to some of these larger concerns. And it also highlights how food bundles are interconnected and shouldn't be seen as separate from agricultural production methods. And so when we include the environmental component in food security, and we look at recommendations, there seems to be a tension in the climate change mitigation recommendations concerning agriculture and food policy. So just to highlight this very quickly, there's a tension, for example, in the IPCC food security recommendations. Quote, many agricultural practices can be optimized and scaled up to advance adaptation throughout the food system. And this is in high confidence. So we've optimized and scaled up here. But then they also, right under this, argue that supply side options should include increased soil organic matter, erosion control, improved land management, genetic improvements, but the diversification in the food system as well. And this includes the integration, the implementation of integrated production systems as well. And so there's a tension here because the optimization and scaling up aligns with that discussion that highlight of feeding the world, right? The increasing of efficiency. So the optimization and scaling up of agricultural practices here could be interpreted as a call for greater industrialization and the greater consolidation of agriculture, the very things that are exacerbating environmental impacts. And there's good call for this because of the amount of food that, the increase in the amount of food that we are producing from the 1960s to the current time period, with one farmer being able to feed 155 people. However, there's also this call as well for increased soil organic matter and for the integrated production systems. But integrated production systems are often focus on increasing soil fertility, on not monocropping, but intercropping and utilizing methods that increase biodiversity. There's a lot of research coming out of England, for example, on farming for biodiversity in mind and reducing environmental impacts, in addition to the argument that we can utilize agricultural areas to sequester carbon. And you could imagine we have so much land being utilized for agriculture now. If we could utilize it to sequester carbon, that's a large amount of carbon. But these integrated production systems that they're talking about largely come out of an international push for sustainable agriculture and the organic movement that has 100+ years of pushing back against industrial agricultural production methods. And so, for example, the Rodale Institute in Kutztown, Pennsylvania, on the east coast of the United States, they've been running side-by-side comparisons of these two different agricultural methods to highlight how farming for rebuilding soil fertility and utilizing organic methods can actually outperform industrialized agriculture when you take drought and potential climate disruptions into account. But these are different ways of thinking about how we should change our agricultural production that are they're built on fundamentally distinct conceptions of what agriculture is and what the focus of agriculture should be. And so we should be then farming with an eye towards biodiversity. Agricultural zones could play a key role in mitigating environmental and animal impacts if they're used to foster ecosystem strength. So on the left side, for example, that's a monocrop. On the right side, we have a farm system where corridors are built into the farming system itself. And farm systems are diverse. They're differentiated by how we value distinct elements, what we're focusing on. Are we focusing on the maximization of yield, the mitigation of negative impacts to biodiversity and surrounding wildlife? Are we focusing on cultural and aesthetic concerns? And so different farming management strategies can be employed for different purposes. And when we're talking about addressing food insecurity, we should keep an eye towards impacts to wildlife and to ecosystem resilience as we're choosing how best to shift or adapt on the ground when we're talking about agricultural production. So, Feeding the World 2.0. When considering the myriad possible strategies to reduce climate change impacts, environmental impacts to ecosystems, animal populations, and species need to be on the table. We need to push away or expand that human-centric ethic to include these environmental impacts. And as species migrate to survive, agriculture needs to be about more than quote unquote feeding the world, which is a huge position in the United States. You always hear that we need to feed the world, right? So thank you very much. That is pretty much my talk.
Thank you very much, Samantha, for this talk, which was really brilliant and inspiring. So we can open the debate if if you have time for discussing with us.
Yes, that would be
I saw. Okay, I saw a comment in the chat. You can read it, but I read for all. It's a comment by Saba El Shawa. Sorry for the pronunciation. That probably is horrible of the pronunciation of the name. What I find interesting is that a lot of these concepts have been continuously stressed by indigenous leaders for many years, clearly showing that environmental justice is also a social justice issue. Do you want to add something to this comment?
Oh, most definitely. And I completely agree. I mean, I was pointing towards, I was debating when I was putting this together about whether or not I should focus on food sovereignty arguments, because the expanded conceptions of food as food is connected to community, self, and environment, and as environmental impacts and impacts to various other components of the community are key conceptions of food justice. And so we are very much going, this is tacitly an argument that we need to shift our understanding of what is food to embrace that more holistic conception. And interestingly, the organic movement that I pushed to, and the food the sustainability movement, some of the early voices in that movement pulled much of their initial conceptions of what agriculture should look like from indigenous leaders and their experiences looking at holistic and integrated farming systems. And that needs to be highlighted. This is not something new that was like Athena, burst forth from Zeus's head. Or no, it's not Zeus. Oh, damn. But anyway, this is something that has a very deep roots, and those roots should be recognized.
Okay, we have another question in chat by Martina. Many thanks for your presentation. I have a question. Resting on the fact that food security is different from food safety, are you aware of environmental climate ethical theories applied to the field of food safety?
No, but I think that this is a fascinating area, and it's an area that we need to focus on, especially with this call for greater efficiency that's equated to increased salmonella and various other contamination issues that have been a huge issue. And Christian Schrader-Frechette, for example, argues that our conception of what is acceptable risk concerning food safety is problematic in that situation. So will that be exacerbated? And I worry that it will, even though this isn't an area I've focused on. And two, concerns over nutritional value. If the nutritional value of our food products are lowering, how do we address that as well? So all of these concerns are so important, and I think that is an area that we definitely need to learn more about, and that should be on the table as well.
Thank you, Samantha. Another question in chat. Everyone prefer the chat this evening. Thank you this is by Elena. Thank you for your presentation. May I pose a question? Do agricultural zones you mentioned include areas dedicated to grow livestock?
Well, this is an important discussion because integrated farming methods tend to include some livestock as part of the larger farm. So, for example, I was a part of the Student Organic Farm, which is a teaching farm at Michigan State University, and they incorporated a multi-crop, a multi-pasture unit structure, where pigs were moved from certain areas of the farm to increase soil fertility and to till the land. And then they were moved out, and then chickens came in and cleaned up after the pigs, because pigs are incredibly messy eaters, you know, and that took care of pests and whatnot, and as well added soil fertility. And so if they're talking about a system like that, then animals would be integrated, or could be integrated. However, I think what you might be concerned about is the issues with industrialized livestock agriculture and the amount of CO2 that is caused by that. And in that situation, the IPCC recommends that we shift to a more plant-based diet. Now, of course, agricultural production, dependent upon the area that we're talking about, might be geared more towards livestock production. However, the argument is that if we shift our diets to eat more vegetables and whatnot, then reduce our animal production, then this will help address or limit some of the impacts that agriculture is having concerning climate change. And I think that is a wise way to go in that context. But again, it depends on the context within which we're farming.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Victorio Morales asked if you can share your email, but we can share the email of Samantha between all the participants to the seminar.
Sure, I could definitely do that. All right. There we go. Woohoo.
Thank you.
I'm glad I'm not a philosopher of technology, because I am horrible at this.
Samantha, I'm not an expert in ethics, but I have a curiosity about your, how can I say, general position, or the general position you presented. Do you think that is possible to articulate an ethical point of view, which is very distant to the human point? Because the very interesting point is that all philosophers at the end of the day are humans, and my suspicion is that the tentative of articulating a point of view which is not anthropocentric is at the end of the day circular in some sense. Mm-hmm. So, and my impression is that the key point of your presentation is that of leaving outside of the door the anthropocentric point of view. So on what philosophical basis you can argue in favor of leaving anthropocentric view outside of the door, the philosophical perspective?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And there's clearly a tension between ecocentric and enlightened anthropocentric views in the environmental ethics literature. And concerning agriculture, I mean, we are essentially utilizing natural areas for, in the end, you know, for our own needs, right? I mean, that's what agriculture is, be that the harvesting of animals or the harvesting of plants in that situation, and the reduction of pests, mice, etc. And so that's why I pointed towards Aldo Leopold as a potential approach that we can take His view, I would argue, even though he's been utilized by many different environmental ethicists to support many different positions, but I take his view as fundamentally one of enlightened anthropocentrism, in that even if our life is basically connected to consumption, and as Derrida argued, we are always forever consuming the animal, so it's not whether or not we should, but how best to, that placing animals in the, placing agricultural lands and whatnot in the ethical sphere will help us be more cognitive and thoughtful about the ways in which we meet our own consumption needs, if ultimately that is human-centric.
Mm-hmm.
But it's an interesting question, and I need to think about it more. It's the question for the ages. You know?
So we have a question by Alessandro.
I think before it was Fausto asking for
That was Victor before me.
Let's see.
Okay. So first Victor, then Alessandro, and then Fausto.
Well,
And
Also.
thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I agree on with all of the things you have said. I have been working on the theory of the eco-modernists. I don't know whether you're familiar with this movement called the eco-modernism, but these people, mainly economists, are convinced that we should sever our ties with nature. That is, that we should become more independent from nature by technological means. So they suggest we should reduce the surface dedicated to agriculture and concentrate in cities. So leave part of the world to nature. But then at the same time, how should we define nature in food security? Many also believe in the death of nature, and in many ways, they also believe in the rise of a kind of synthetic world. And I just read a little bit about what you're also writing, and in terms of biotechnologies, I mean, the possibility of producing synthetic food is actually an issue. So how do we deal with these issues? At the same time, you have raised these moral concerns about the environment and the land ethic, which I support. So what's your take on that?
Well, I think this is a fascinating question with many moving parts and many important components. First, concerning food security in cities, I've written quite a bit, but I think that urban agriculture initiatives are imperative for ensuring food security around the world, not as a replacement for our larger agricultural production, because at this point, it's not producing enough to feed current populations. Although I have looked at the literature, I have a couple of friends who do work on the hydroponics and the various different types of large-scale agriculture that can be done in urban components. But I don't see that as a separation of food production from nature. I feel that food production is always reliant upon natural processes, even if we have greater sort of control over it. But essentially, control is hubris in that situation, right? So let's see. So I don't see it as a severing of nature, but rather as a greater integration of natural areas, almost arco santi. It's a greater integration of natural areas with human experience. And so in recognizing that we are a species, Homo sapiens sapien, forever embedded into larger ecosystem structures where we consume and are consumed, ultimately in our death by others.
Thank you very much.
And
Thank you,
I
Samantha.
want to talk with
missed
you
the.
more about this stuff. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Oh no,
No,
I was just saying I would like to. Oh, sorry.
No, but please add what you want.
Oh no, I was just saying, Victor, I'd love to talk with you more about this, definitely over email, because I need to unpack this more and think about some of the conceptual work being done by eco-modernists.
I will give it to you. Thank you for your email address. I would like to stay in touch with you as well. Thanks.
Okay, I saw that I missed the question by Andrea Tafuri, which is written in chat. And the question is the following. Great presentation, thank you so much. How we can realistically afford to feed a higher population during a decarbonization process, while our alternative solution won't be able to guarantee neither the actual food production levels? This is the first part of the question. Where is the ethic on the actual narrative related to a soft transition process? While we are sure that if we want to save biodiversity and ecosystem, we will not be able to feed billions of people.
Yeah, and that's again another $1 million question, right? At this point, even our industrial agricultural systems are being strained. And let's get real, especially in the United States, these are not built on sustainability, to highlight sustainability. And so, yeah, I think that's the tension in the IPCC recommendations, because there is this need to increase efficiency, right? However, there is also a need to ensure that we're addressing erosion, we're ensuring that drought resistance is brought to the forefront, and that biodiversity levels are protected. And so how should there be a soft transition into this area? Rodale and Institute and advocates of the organic movement argue that these alternative systems can produce as much, if not more, food than industrial, but this is sort of a proof of concept. It's not something that we have fully embraced yet. And so I think you're right. I think that gradual transition is important, and it's going to be tough. There are no good answers here, right? It's something is lost as we're facing a dire situation. But in ecosystem resilience should be on the table when we're discussing how to feed the world. And I feel like that gets missed, especially here in the United States, when you see that push for greater efficiency almost treated as a mantra. We need to feed the world, and so let us do whatever we want to do concerning efficiency and not worry about environmental impacts. It drives me crazy.
Okay. Please, Fausto, it's your turn.
So, thank you very much for your great presentation, really. And well, I have like a very simple question, because I read somewhere that actually 1.3 billion people or something like this get some income from animal agriculture. If we also add the people who work with meat somehow, I mean, the people who transport meat and then the people who sell meats in pub, restaurants, and so on, I think this number will be quite huge. So I was thinking, let's assume that we do what scientists and ethicists recommended, that is to say that we all reduce our meat consumption. I guess that if we do it, I mean, these people who get an income from animal agriculture, but in general for meat, will be imposed a mitigation burden somehow, because I mean, we lower the demand of meat, we reduce the prices, and so we also reduce profits for these people. So my question is according to you, but I mean also in general for the food justice literature, compensation for these people part of food justice and more generally of climate justice? Because I make a parallel, for example, with all the debate on the carbon tax, and there, for example, how all the discourse about how revenues should be redistributed to offset the mitigation burden is central. Not only for the social acceptability of these measures, but also, I mean, from a normative point of view. So this was my question, and thank you again.
That is a very good question. And I mean, in that situation, when we're looking at agricultural recommendations, the argument that there are arguments that we should even adopt a vegetarian diet and do away with meat consumption altogether. Those largely focus on critiques of industrial agricultural production of meat products, the large feedlots and the utilization of grains and corn and whatnot in order to feed these large herds of animals. However, if we take that out of the equation and we look at how agricultural lands are being utilized around the globe, there are many areas where meat production, where grazing is the ideal utilization of that land, that it's not fit for crop production. And if we did push that mandate, that could actually reduce food security in communities that are reliant upon their herds for survival and for part of their food, food basket, so to speak. So I argue that we have to be very careful, or I think that we need to be very careful when we're making these overarching recommendations concerning what adaptation strategies should look like on the ground. And if we're looking at this from a food justice perspective and a food sovereignty perspective, then providing recommendations and highlighting important potential ways to address concerns, but ultimately leaving that up to which one is implemented by the community that's going to be impacted, would be one way of honoring food sovereignty, the sovereignty component of food justice, and ensuring that adaptation strategies are tailored to the nuanced and delicate agricultural realities on the ground. And that's one of the big issues I actually have with some of my colleagues who tend to make these overarching statements. Well, all of this land can be utilized for crop production. And it's like, no, it depends on what which area we're talking about. I absolutely love your comment. Yeah.
Okay. Alessandro, please.
Thank you very much for your interesting paper and a really stimulating paper. And my question is quite similar, not really similar, but is on the same topic of Fausto's question, more or less. It is about prices in food production, for example. If we look to the prices of vegetables, for example, in Western countries, we can find some prices that are different from other countries, maybe poor countries. And so my question is relating how to maybe fill the difference, the gap between the Western countries and the poor countries, because we are, what I can say, we have a really strong difference in technological approach in agriculture. At the same time, wages of people are different, and at the same time, the sort of investment on properties of land is expected to be refunded differently from the Western countries to the poor countries. And so if we look to the policies in the Western countries, we can see that there is a really protective agriculture here in Europe and also in the United States. Prices are, what I can say, are not managed by the so-called free market, but we have a lot of public finances in, for example, in crop or wheat and things like that. And from my point of view, the idea I have developed during years is that, what I can say, agriculture is a quite sort of mafia, what I can say, of the developed countries compared to the poor countries. I'm talking about that because I have a personal experience. My parents were producer of Parmigiano Reggiano cheese, that is quite famous for cheese, and I know very well what are the dynamics of agriculture in Europe and in particular in Italy.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. And it goes back to the question concerning whether or not feeding the world is actually rhetoric, right? I mean, in that situation, I mean, in the context of the United States, for example, agriculture is highly protected. We have the U.S. Farm Bill that comes out, every 5 or so years, and there are subsidies clearly attached to that support different types of agricultural production, including our main grains, right? Like corn, wheat, rice, soy, so much soy everywhere, and that not only protects, keeps our prices artificially low, but it also determines what farmers are growing and how they are growing those. And so, yeah, I mean, one could argue that that is fundamentally a protective market could potentially be highly problematic and have negative consequences outside of those contexts. And this isn't an area that I know much about, but it's an area that I need to learn more because, ethics and policy and actualizing positions on the ground are important. And yeah, so again, another $1 million question, right? How do we regulate prices across national boundaries, especially when some countries are getting the short end of the stick, so to speak.
Yeah, I think it is a global question that is necessary to manage globally because food providing is a problem for the poor countries. And now in the Western countries, we have an excess of food production. And so it is quite unbalanced situation. And recalling the question of Victor Morales, what about Monsanto? I only can say that it was bought by Bayer, that is one of the most important pharmaceutical company. And so what I can say, we are talking about our food at the same time our drugs at the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
thank you, Alessandro and Samantha.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Please, no. Please add what you want.
Oh no, I was just going to say you've given me a lot to think about. I'm absolutely loving this conversation. So much to think about.
Any other question, comments, or something to add? Apparently no. Victor, you raise your hand or your finger.
May I just mention it? Organic ways of producing food. You mentioned that, and you mentioned that agriculture, industrial farming damages the environment. So what about the organic ways of producing food? I mean, you also, I think, mentioned that we cannot achieve our goals by just simply applying this kind of organic production or technologies. So how can we balance that off? On the one hand, looking back at, say, the wisdom that has been acquired by many communities over the world, and the reduction of chemicals, for instance, looking after the environment, mitigating the effects of farming, industrial farming. But on the other hand, there is this need of feeding the world. So how can we balance that off?
I think that's an excellent question. I mean, organic production methods, depending upon which ones we're looking at, they can be large scale, they can be small scale. The methods that Rodale Institute utilizes, for example, are on the large scale side of that sector. So they do produce a good amount of food, and it's also the increase or decrease in yields is influenced by concerns over long-term sustainability. So one of the big discussions concerning conventional farming methods and organic farming methods is, are we looking at yields for the next 5 years, 10 years, or are we looking at increasing drought resistance and yields over the longer term with soil fertility? And so they might be smaller there might be smaller harvests, but the harvests are guaranteed. There's a higher, well, not guaranteed, nothing is guaranteed in farming, but there's a higher guarantee that you will have a crop. And so how do we weigh these different values then? Do we focus on increasing the yields that are possible, or do we focus on increasing the resilience of the system so that we can greater rely on the availability to utilize the food security literature? But I also, there's a problem with consolidation here, in that there are concerns that any sort of large-scale agricultural system alone would be able to address the issues. So there are arguments in the urban agriculture literature and in the food justice literature that deconsolidation is actually an important, or should actually play an important role in helping us achieve food security, not because it produces more food, which it could, but because it provides the means of producing food in the hands of communities so that they can change agricultural production methods quickly, and that safety nets can be utilized in context. So urban agriculture, even though it's not going to feed everyone in the city, if there are shortages and whatnot, you will have access to food. And we've seen that in Detroit, for example, during the Great Depression, when food levels, food availability plummeted in that context. They literally planted potatoes. It was I forget the name of the mayor, but they took a large swath of land. Everyone came together, planted potatoes so that there would be a crop to help mitigate the negative impacts of the larger food system on the local community. Of course, when food availability regulated, then the potatoes went by the wayside, and they put a industrial park in that area. But it highlights how various scales of agriculture, various types of agriculture, diversity of agricultural production, and greater access could potentially help increase the resiliency of the food system itself. At least that's one of the arguments coming from the urban ag literature.
Thanks a lot.
Okay. Anyone want to add something, or to add a comment or a question?
If no one is actually doing it, I would just like to add something to my question, if I may. But I don't want to take up all the time, so I just wait if someone has a question.
No, we have I think a couple of minutes, so if you want to add the very last question, is okay for us.
On the topic of resilience, is genetic modification, or to what extent would make the crops more resilient, more resistant, okay, and still be considered organic? Is it because you also have been working on gene editing? So where does technology at that level still be considered organic, still be, are we still talking about natural products, but they have been slightly or largely modified to make them more resilient? So what's your take on that?
Yeah, and that again is a wonderful question. At least in the United States, with the current organic standards and certification board, genetically modified organisms are not considered organic, at least in this context. Now, the genetic modification of crops is seen as one of the potential ways that could be utilized or approaches that could be utilized to increase resiliency. And conventional agricultural growers have lukewarmly embraced this due to the fact that there is a huge consumer discussion going on with truncated positions pro-GMO and anti-GMO factions coming to the forefront and sort of coming into conflict. And as food is, a product, there's concerns that genetic modification could potentially negatively impact that, especially when we're talking about animal modifications. Currently in the United States, over 96% of food products contain a genetically modified organism. And so the US has very much embraced this biotechnology in their food system, but then there's that larger discussion, right, with different countries having fundamentally different conceptions about whether or not this is an acceptable or not acceptable application. The organic movement, though, argues that you can increase resiliency not by having to modify the organism itself, but by ensuring that the soil is healthy and by increasing fertility in these other aspects. And so, again, that speaks to two fundamentally different paradigms of farming. This top-down greater control versus a bottom-up utilization of natural processes as two approaches to bring about a greater resiliency in the food system. And there's a clear tension there.
Thanks a lot. We'll keep in touch.
I'm looking forward to it. I'm like, let's Zoom.
Thank you very much for your time, Samantha, and for sharing your researches very, very early in the morning, which is great for us, but not for you, I guess. I just want to remember our next meeting, which is scheduled for December 15th. We will have with us Christian Batz from the Kiel University, and the title of the meeting will be Assessing Climate Policies from Justice Perspective, Finance for Adaptation, Loss and Damage and Beyond. So thank you again, and I hope we will remain in touch for the future. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all very much. And I very much appreciated your comments, and thank you for listening to my research. This is a wonderful experience, and I appreciate it.
Bye-bye.